August 15, 1945. Japan has announced its surrender. After 6 long years, the deadliest war in human history has finally come to an end. Across the world, people wept, not only from joy, but from exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. The Second World War was over, yet peace had not truly begun. In London, millions poured into the streets to celebrate victory over Japan Day. Church bells rang across Paris, echoing through the ruins of a battered continent. In Moscow, artillery salutes thundered over Red Square as Stalin declared that the people have triumphed. But in Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, there was only silence. Entire cities lay in ashes. The air was thick with smoke and loss. For the first time in history, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people through the radio, telling them to endure the unendurable and begin a new life. His calm words carried through the devastation, and the entire nation fell silent. The war had ended, but the peace was uncertain. Over 60 million lives had been lost. Whole continents were in ruins. Borders had shifted, nations had fallen, and families had vanished. Behind every victory headline stood a single haunting question. What comes next? The New York Times wrote that week, "We have won the war, but the victory brings no joy. Now we must learn to rebuild ourselves." On the BBC, a solemn voice declared, "The war is over, but the peace has not yet begun." As the smoke cleared, humanity entered a new age, one not yet named, but already felt. The world was dividing, politically, economically, even morally. It would soon be called the Cold War. But in August 1945, it was simply the beginning of a new world. The summer of 1945 was not a time of celebration. It was a time of silence, the kind that follows a storm so violent it leaves nothing standing. The guns had fallen quiet, but the echoes of destruction rolled across the continents. From London to Leningrad, from Warsaw to Hiroshima, the world had stopped to count its dead and to wonder what was left to save. Across Europe, whole nations were erased. Warsaw, once called the Paris of the East, was gone, 85% destroyed. The Polish capital had become a wasteland of brick and smoke. Berlin, the heart of Hitler's empire, was nothing but a skeleton. Soviet soldiers marched through its empty streets while American and British troops watched from their own sectors. The victors now shared the ruins. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, an uneasy alliance already beginning to crack. Millions wandered the roads with nowhere to go. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration reported over 40 million displaced people across Europe. Families lived in tents and railway stations, carrying faded photographs of loved ones they might never find. Trains full of prisoners of war rolled back into their countries, but home no longer existed. In France, soldiers returned to ruins. In Poland, Jewish survivors found only silence where their communities had once thrived. Entire towns were gone, erased not just from the land but from memory. In Britain, the streets were still lined with bombed-out buildings. Victory did not end hunger. Ration books remained in use. Butter, meat, and even bread were still scarce. The BBC's radio bulletins carried a new tone, no longer shouting of victory, but whispering of exhaustion. One announcer said, "We have won, but the victory has left us empty. We must now learn to live again." People queued not for safety shelters, but for bread and coal. And yet, beneath the rubble, Londoners rebuilt, brick by brick, and with quiet pride. In the East, Stalin's Soviet Union emerged from the war bloodied but powerful. The Red Army had marched farther than any force in Russian history, all the way to Berlin. But the cost was unimaginable. More than 20 million Soviet citizens were dead. Whole villages wiped from existence. Factories dismantled. Cities in ruins. Now, the Soviet leadership faced a new mission. Not just to rebuild, but to dominate. Stalin ordered an immense reconstruction campaign. 1,700 cities, 70,000 villages. The message was clear. The war had proven the power of the Soviet state, and that power would not fade in peace. Across the world, the story was no different. Only the language of suffering changed. In China, the war against Japan had left more than 10 million dead. In the Philippines, Manila was a graveyard of civilians. And in Japan itself, the devastation defied belief. Tokyo, once a city of wooden homes and bright lanterns, had burned for 3 nights under American firebombs. Over 100,000 people died in the March 1945 raids alone. Then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities turned to shadows in a single flash. By the end of the year, 9 million Japanese were homeless, millions starving. American occupation forces described a nation surviving on silence. But amid the ruin, a strange paradox appeared. The victors, too, were afraid. In Washington, President Harry Truman faced a new kind of responsibility, the stewardship of atomic power. For the first time in history, one nation held the ability to destroy civilization itself. Across the Atlantic, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee warned that peace will test us more severely than war. And in the Kremlin, Stalin already saw the future not in peace, but in power. The alliance that had won the war was beginning to crumble, replaced by suspicion. By the final months of 1945, cities slowly flickered back to life. In Paris, cafe lights returned. In Berlin, children played among the ruins. In Moscow, banners of victory hung above ration lines. But beneath the surface, the world was splitting into two. Freedom on one side, control on the other. The words had not yet been spoken, but history was already writing them. East and West, capitalism and communism, liberty and fear. The war was over, but its shadow stretched far beyond 1945. Humanity had survived destruction, only to face a new struggle, to rebuild a world where peace could last longer than victory itself. The war had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. In 1945, the victors of the Second World War faced a new and far more delicate challenge: to rebuild a world that had nearly destroyed itself, and to decide who was to blame for the chaos left behind. In the autumn of that year, representatives from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco. The city buzzed with a fragile optimism as diplomats signed the founding charter of a new organization, the United Nations. For the first time, the world dared to imagine that collective diplomacy might replace the cycle of war. The words of the charter promised to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. For a brief moment, humanity believed it, but the optimism of the West did not echo everywhere. In Moscow, Stalin viewed the new organization with suspicion. The Soviet Union had lost more lives than any other nation, more than 20 million, and it had no intention of letting Western nations dictate the peace. At the same time, in Washington and London, leaders wondered how long their uneasy alliance with the Kremlin could last. The war had forged friendship out of necessity, not trust. Now that the common enemy was gone, only ideology remained. Yet before the Cold War could begin, the world demanded justice. In November 1945, in a devastated German city called Nuremberg, the first international tribunal in human history opened its doors. The world's most notorious war criminals stood before judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and others faced charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For the first time, the defense, "I was just following orders," was rejected as invalid. The tribunal's message was clear. No leader, no soldier, no nation could hide behind authority again. But justice was complicated. Outside the courtroom, millions of ordinary Germans lived in ruins, hungry, humiliated, and afraid. Many questioned whether punishment could truly heal a world so broken. Even some Allied leaders worried that the trials would deepen resentment instead of reconciliation. And yet, the images from Nuremberg, the faces of men who had unleashed global terror, left no doubt that accountability was necessary, however imperfect. Thousands of kilometers away in Japan, another tribunal began in Tokyo. 28 Japanese military and political leaders, including former Prime Minister Tojo, were tried for crimes against peace. The proceedings lasted for more than 2 years. For many in Asia, from China to the Philippines, these trials offered a measure of closure. But for others, they raised painful questions. If justice was truly universal, why were the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki never judged by the same standard? That silent contradiction lingered in the conscience of the New World Order. As 1946 unfolded, nations looked inward. Factories reopened. Refugees returned home, or what was left of it. Across Europe, American aid and Soviet control began to shape two very different recoveries. In the West, US dollars funded reconstruction through what would later become the Marshall Plan. In the East, the Red Army dismantled German industries and shipped them to the Soviet Union as reparations. Each side claimed it was rebuilding peace. In truth, both were building influence. Meanwhile, in New York City, the newly formed United Nations opened its first General Assembly. It was meant to be a symbol of global unity, yet even in its first meetings, the divisions were clear. American delegates spoke of freedom and democracy. Soviet representatives warned against imperialist interference. The ideological lines of the Cold War were being drawn, not on battlefields, but across conference tables and microphones. Still, for ordinary people, there was hope. In France, children returned to schools rebuilt from rubble. In Britain, the National Health Service was being born, a promise that everyone, rich or poor, had a right to medical care. In Japan, under General Douglas MacArthur's supervision, a new constitution granted women the right to vote. For millions, these changes symbolized a new beginning, a belief that the sacrifices of war might at last lead to something better. But beneath that hope, the old fears never truly disappeared. The world had witnessed its own capacity for destruction, and no one could forget the glow of the atomic age. In the deserts of New Mexico, and in the laboratories of the Soviet Union, the race for new weapons quietly began. The dream of peace was already haunted by the shadow of power. By the end of 1946, humanity stood at a strange crossroads. For the first time, nations were trying to govern morality itself, to write laws that reached beyond borders and leaders. The United Nations, the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, and the new democratic constitutions all represented humanity's desperate attempt to prove that civilization could learn from its own horrors. But history has a way of repeating itself, especially when fear and ambition walk hand in hand. The world was rebuilding, yes. Cities were rising, factories humming, flags flying again. But the cracks beneath the surface were deepening. In Washington and Moscow, new strategies were already being written. And from those strategies, a new kind of conflict was about to emerge. One fought not with tanks and guns, but with words, spies, and the constant threat of annihilation. By 1947, the optimism that had filled the post-war years was fading fast. The unity that had carried the Allies to victory was crumbling, replaced by fear, suspicion, and ideology. The new world promised in 1945 was dividing not by geography, but by belief. Winston Churchill had warned of it first. In March 1946, in a small American town called Fulton, Missouri, he delivered a speech that shocked the world. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Those words captured the moment perfectly. Behind that curtain, Stalin's Soviet Union was tightening control over Eastern Europe. In front of it, the United States and its allies were searching for a way to contain that power. In the ashes of war, a new kind of battle began, one of ideas. Democracy versus communism. Freedom versus control. Each side saw itself as the defender of civilization. Each believed the other wanted to dominate the world. In Eastern Europe, Soviet influence spread rapidly. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all under the shadow of Moscow. The Red Army had liberated these countries, but liberation soon turned to occupation.
Opposition partie disappeared.
Censorship grew. By 1947, most Eastern European governments were communist in name and Soviet in loyalty. Stalin called it the people's democracy. To the West, it looked like an empire in disguise. Across the Atlantic, President Harry Truman faced a historic decision. In February 1947, Britain informed the United States it could no longer support the struggling governments of Greece and Turkey against communist uprisings. If America did nothing, both nations could fall under Soviet influence. So, Truman went before Congress and announced what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." It was more than a speech, it was a declaration of global responsibility. The age of American isolation was over. The Soviet response was immediate. In Moscow, the Soviet newspaper Pravda, meaning truth, accused the United States of imperialist expansion. Stalin saw the Truman Doctrine as proof that America intended to encircle the Soviet Union with hostile states. And so the battle lines hardened. That same year, a new plan emerged from Washington, one that would change the shape of Europe forever. Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed a vast program of financial aid to rebuild war-torn Europe. He believed that economic recovery was the key to peace. Over the next 4 years, the United States poured more than $13 billion into Europe's reconstruction. An enormous sum at the time. Factories reopened, railways were repaired, and hope returned. But the Soviet Union refused to take part. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as a Trojan horse for American influence. He forbade Eastern European nations from joining. The result was unmistakable. Western Europe began to prosper, while the East remained under strict Soviet control. In response, Stalin formed Cominform, short for the Communist Information Bureau, an organization designed to coordinate propaganda and control among his allies. Its mission: to strengthen the unity of socialist countries and resist the capitalist threat. Newspapers in Prague, Warsaw, and Bucharest echoed the same message. The West wanted domination, the Soviet Union wanted peace. But words were not the only weapons. In 1948, tension turned to crisis. Germany, still divided into 4 occupation zones, had become the heart of the conflict. The Western Allies planned to unite their zones into a single economic unit, introducing a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, meaning German mark. To Stalin, this was an act of aggression. He responded by cutting off all road and rail access to West Berlin, a city deep inside the Soviet zone. Overnight, 2.5 million people were trapped, surrounded by Soviet forces without food, fuel, or supplies. The world held its breath. Would the United States retreat or would it fight? Neither happened. Instead, the Allies launched one of the greatest humanitarian operations in history, the Berlin Airlift. For 11 months, American and British planes flew day and night, delivering food, coal, and medicine to the people of West Berlin. At its height, a plane landed every 45 seconds. By May 1949, Stalin finally lifted the blockade, defeated without a single shot fired. The message was clear. The world was now divided, and Berlin stood at the very center of that division. The blockade of Berlin had ended, but peace was still far away. The airlift had proven that the West would not abandon Europe, and the Soviet Union understood that force alone would no longer guarantee control. The balance of power was shifting again. In April 1949, 12 nations gathered in Washington to sign a new treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Its purpose was simple but revolutionary. An attack against one would be considered an attack against all. For the first time, the United States had entered a permanent military alliance in peacetime. It marked the birth of a new front in the ideological struggle. Stalin's response came quickly. He strengthened his hold on Eastern Europe and began accelerating the Soviet Union's atomic program. On August 29, 1949, deep in the Kazakh steppe, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, a near-perfect copy of the American design. The explosion lit up the sky over Semipalatinsk, and with it, the brief monopoly of American power vanished. Now, both sides possessed weapons capable of ending civilization. That same year, another global shift took place. In Asia, China, long torn apart by civil war, finally fell under communist control. Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and declared the birth of the People's Republic of China. For the West, it was a stunning loss. For Stalin, it was a triumph. The world's most populous nation had joined his ideological camp. But beneath their smiles, Moscow and Beijing trusted each other no more than Washington trusted London. Even among allies, the Cold War was breeding suspicion. By the dawn of the 1950s, the dividing lines were no longer political theories. They were visible borders, guarded by soldiers and watched from the skies. Europe was split, Asia was changing, and the balance of fear had replaced the balance of power. The dream of a united post-war world had died. In its place stood two superpowers, each convinced it was defending freedom, each certain the other threatened humanity. The guns of 1945 had fallen silent, but the noise of the new conflict was only beginning to rise. The year was 1949. Humanity had unlocked the secret of the atom, and with it, a new era began. For the first time, the world lived with the knowledge that a single weapon could end all life on Earth. The atomic bomb was no longer a symbol of victory. It had become a shadow over civilization itself. In August of that year, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, deep in the endless steppe. Until that moment, the United States believed it would control nuclear power for decades. But the shock was immediate. The monopoly was over. American newspapers screamed the headline, "The Russians have the bomb." And just like that, the Cold War entered its most dangerous phase. President Harry Truman faced an impossible question. How could the United States stay safe in a world where its enemy now held the same power? His answer came swiftly. In 1950, he authorized the creation of a new kind of weapon, the hydrogen bomb, a device hundreds of times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. The arms race had begun. From that moment, both superpowers were trapped in a deadly cycle, building more weapons not to fight, but to prevent the other from ever striking first. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin celebrated the success of his scientists. He declared that socialism had caught up with the capitalist world. But behind the propaganda, the truth was harsh. The Soviet people were exhausted. Food was scarce. Cities were still scarred by war, and fear ruled daily life. Still, the government had one priority: survival through strength. Factories that once built tanks were now building missiles. Children learned about atomic energy not as science, but as destiny. Meanwhile, fear spread through the West. In the United States, newspapers and politicians warned that communist spies had stolen nuclear secrets. In 1950, a British physicist named Klaus Fuchs was arrested for passing atomic data to the Soviets. Soon after, an American couple, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were accused of espionage. Their trial ended with execution in 1953. Whether guilty or not, their fate symbolized a nation consumed by fear. That fear had a name: McCarthyism, after Senator Joseph McCarthy, who rose to fame by claiming that communists had infiltrated the U.S. government. He waved papers, shouted accusations, and destroyed careers. Actors, writers, teachers, even war heroes were accused without proof. It was called the Red Scare, and it turned neighbors into suspects. Freedom, once America's proudest word, now came with conditions. But while America fought its ghosts at home, the Cold War turned hot abroad. In June 1950, the Korean Peninsula, divided since 1945, erupted into war. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and later by China, invaded South Korea, supported by the United States and the newly formed United Nations. Within weeks, Seoul had fallen. The United States led a UN coalition to push the North back. But when Allied forces neared the Chinese border, Mao Zedong sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops across the Yalu River. The war exploded into chaos. Entire cities were flattened. Civilians froze on refugee roads. Soldiers vanished into the snow. Seoul changed hands 4 times in 3 years. And all the while, both sides held the bomb in reserve, a silent threat behind every decision. President Truman refused to use atomic weapons in Korea, fearing it would ignite a third world war. Instead, the conflict dragged on until 1953. More than 2 million people died. When the armistice was signed, the border between North and South Korea lay almost exactly where it had started. The war ended as it began, divided, unresolved, and bitter. Back in Moscow, Stalin watched the Korean conflict as proof that his strategy of confrontation worked. But inside the Kremlin, his paranoia deepened. He saw enemies everywhere, even among his most loyal allies. In the early 1950s, new purges began. Writers, generals, and ministers vanished into prisons. Fear became the language of survival. By 1952, both superpowers had crossed another line. The United States tested the hydrogen bomb in the Pacific, vaporizing an entire island. The Soviet Union followed a year later with its own version. Scientists began using the word megaton, meaning 1 million tons of TNT, to describe the power of these weapons. Mankind now measured destruction in unimaginable scales. Even as governments built more bombs, a few voices began to question the madness. British philosopher Bertrand Russell warned that humanity faced a choice: coexistence or extinction. In the US, physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, often called the father of the atomic bomb, publicly expressed regret. He quoted a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But their warnings were drowned out by fear and politics. The arms race continued. Then, on March 5, 1953, the news echoed across the world. Joseph Stalin was dead. His funeral in Moscow was a display of orchestrated grief. Millions of citizens lining the streets, weeping for the man who had ruled them through terror and triumph alike. But behind the mourning lay uncertainty. Who would lead the Soviet Union now? What would become of the world Stalin had built? For the Soviet people, his death ended one era of fear. But for the world, it marked the beginning of a new and unpredictable chapter. In Washington, in London, and in every capital on Earth, leaders watched and waited. Would the Soviet Union collapse, or would it rise again under new command? By 1953, humanity stood at a crossroads. The planet had survived the most devastating war in history, only to find itself living under the threat of a new one. A war that could end civilization in minutes. The atomic age had arrived, and the race for power was no longer about who could win, but about who could survive. Moscow, March 1953. The city stood still under a heavy gray sky. Millions lined the frozen streets as the body of Joseph Stalin was carried toward the Hall of Columns. Some wept, others watched in silence, unsure whether to mourn or to hope. The man who had ruled them for nearly 3 decades, through famine, terror, and war, was gone. Inside the Kremlin, fear replaced grief. No one knew what came next. The Soviet Union was a vast empire built around one man's will. Without him, it risked collapsing under its own weight. In the days after Stalin's death, the Soviet leadership scrambled to find balance. Power was divided between 3 men, Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the secret police. Beria moved fast. He promised reform, released prisoners, and hinted at liberalization. But few trusted him. To millions, he was the face of Stalin's terror, the man who had signed the death warrants of thousands. By the end of 1953, Beria himself was arrested, accused of treason, and quietly executed. The message was clear. The Soviet Union would change, but slowly and only on its own terms. Among those rising quietly through the chaos was a Ukrainian-born politician, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. A former factory worker and loyal communist, Khrushchev had survived Stalin's purges by keeping a low profile. Now he began consolidating power, visiting factories, shaking hands, and speaking to workers in their own language. He promised a return to Lenin's true path, a softer socialism that would improve lives, not destroy them. At first, few outside Moscow noticed, but by 1955, Khrushchev had outmaneuvered his rivals. He became the first secretary of the Communist Party, the most powerful position in the Soviet state. And with new leadership came new challenges. The first test arrived in June 1953, in East Germany. Workers in Berlin, frustrated by poor conditions and rising work quotas, took to the streets. They demanded better pay, free elections, and an end to Soviet control. What began as a protest turned into a revolt. Crowds stormed government buildings. Police stations were seized. For a moment, it seemed that the Iron Curtain might crack. But the Soviet response was swift and brutal. Tanks rolled into the streets of East Berlin. Gunfire echoed through the city. By nightfall, hundreds were dead or imprisoned. The uprising was crushed, but the illusion of total control had been shattered. For the first time, the world had seen that life behind the curtain was not stable, not united, and not free. Across Eastern Europe, whispers spread. Of hope, of change, of rebellion. And Khrushchev, though still consolidating his rule, could not ignore them. He began cautiously reforming Soviet policies. Censorship was slightly relaxed. Political prisoners were slowly released. New housing projects rose in Moscow, and propaganda now spoke not only of power, but of peaceful coexistence. Yet beneath the surface, the machinery of fear still worked. The KGB, the new name for the secret police, replaced the old NKVD. Surveillance continued, dissent was punished, and the party remained above all. It was not freedom, only a change in tone. Meanwhile, beyond the Soviet borders, the world was reorganizing. In 1955, the Western Alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, grew stronger. To counter it, the Soviet Union created its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. It united the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, under Moscow's command. On paper, it was a defensive alliance. In reality, it was a chain of control binding half of Europe to Soviet authority. That same year, Khrushchev made a historic trip to Belgrade, Yugoslavia. It was a bold move. In 1948, Yugoslavia's leader Josip Broz Tito had broken away from Stalin, defying Moscow's control. Now, Khrushchev extended his hand, apologizing for past hostilities and calling for socialist unity. It was a signal to the world. The new Soviet Union wanted dialogue, not domination. But even as he spoke of peace, Soviet troops remained stationed from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The tension within the Eastern Bloc was growing. In Poland, workers protested low wages. In Hungary, students whispered about freedom. And in both, the same question lingered: had Stalin's death really changed anything? Khrushchev believed he could answer that question. In February 1956, during a closed session of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, he delivered a speech that would shake the world. It became known as the secret speech. For 4 hours, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes, exposing the purges, the lies, and the terror. He called Stalin a tyrant and accused him of betraying Lenin's ideals. To the delegates in the room, it was unthinkable, a Soviet leader condemning his predecessor. But Khrushchev believed it was the only way to save communism from its own past. The consequences were immediate and explosive. In Poland, protests turned into riots. In Hungary, the people rose up, demanding independence and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a few weeks, Budapest became the center of a revolution, the first true rebellion against Moscow's rule. But the Kremlin would not allow it. In November 1956, Soviet tanks thundered into Hungary. The city burned. Thousands were killed. Tens of thousands fled across the borders. By the end of the month, the revolution was crushed. Prime Minister Imre Nagy, who had called for Hungary's neutrality, was arrested and later executed. The dream of freedom had ended in blood. Still, the world had seen something new. For the first time since 1945, the Soviet Empire had been openly challenged, and it had trembled. The Iron Curtain still stood, but cracks had appeared. Inside those cracks, the light of resistance began to grow. As 1956 drew to a close, Nikita Khrushchev stood stronger than ever, but the balance he sought between reform and control was already slipping away. The age of Stalin was over. The age of uncertainty had begun. The year was 1957. Barely a year after crushing the Hungarian uprising, the Soviet Union stunned the world once again. Not with tanks, but with science. On October 4th, a silver sphere the size of a beach ball rose into the night sky. Its name was Sputnik, meaning satellite in Russian. It circled the Earth every 96 minutes, beeping a steady metallic signal that could be heard on radios around the globe. For the first time in history, mankind had touched the stars. But for the United States, that sound, the beep, 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 was not hope. It was fear. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, they could also launch nuclear warheads across continents. The Cold War had just entered a new battlefield, the skies above. In Washington, the shock was immediate. President Dwight D. Eisenhower called it a wake-up call for America. Schools began teaching science and mathematics with military urgency. Billions were poured into research and missile development. The space race had begun, a race not for exploration, but for dominance. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev basked in triumph. He told the world that socialism had not only matched capitalism, it had surpassed it. Propaganda posters showed rockets rising from the Soviet Union, painting a future of peace, progress, and power. But behind the confidence, pressure was building. The Soviet economy was fragile, its technology often unreliable, and its people still recovering from decades of hardship. Khrushchev was gambling, using spectacle to hide instability. In 1960, his gamble would face a test. On May 1st, as Soviet forces prepared for a military parade, radar operators detected a high-altitude aircraft crossing Soviet airspace. It was an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, sent to photograph secret missile sites. The Soviets shot it down. Washington first denied everything, then, when evidence was displayed in Moscow, admitted the truth. The embarrassment was enormous. Khrushchev canceled an upcoming peace summit with President Eisenhower, and any hope of easing tensions vanished overnight. By now, the world was living on a knife's edge. Each side possessed thousands of nuclear weapons. Missiles sat in underground silos, ready to launch within minutes. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks that could never protect them. In the Soviet Union, propaganda films taught citizens how to survive atomic war. Both sides knew that if war began, there would be no victors, only ashes. Yet even as the danger grew, the competition continued. In 1961, the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. He orbited the Earth for 108 minutes and returned a hero. Khrushchev hailed him as proof of communism's superiority, proclaiming, "I see no God up here." For the United States, it was another humiliation but also a challenge. A young American president, John F. Kennedy, vowed that America would not be outdone. He promised that the United States would land a man on the moon before the decade's end. But even as Kennedy spoke of space, the confrontation on Earth was intensifying. In August 1961, Soviet-backed East Germany began building a wall through the heart of Berlin. Families were divided overnight. Barbed wire cut through streets and train lines. The Berlin Wall became the ultimate symbol of a divided world. Freedom on one side, control on the other. Kennedy responded with determination, sending U.S. troops to reinforce West Berlin. He declared, "We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin." The standoff was tense, but neither side crossed the line. For now, the city remained split but alive. Then, in 1962, came the moment when the world came closer to destruction than ever before. It began quietly in the Caribbean. U.S. reconnaissance planes photographed strange objects being assembled in the jungles of Cuba, Soviet nuclear missiles, capable of reaching Washington, New York, or Chicago in minutes. For President Kennedy, it was an unthinkable threat, nuclear weapons less than 100 miles from American shores. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For 13 days in October 1962, the world held its breath. American warships surrounded the island, enforcing a naval blockade. Soviet cargo ships steamed toward Cuba, carrying more missiles. One misstep, one miscommunication could ignite World War III. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced an impossible choice: retreat and lose face, or advance and risk annihilation. Messages passed in secrecy between Washington and Moscow. Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, met with the Soviet ambassador, searching for a way out. Finally, on October 28th, a deal was struck. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and in return, the United States quietly agreed to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. The world exhaled. The ships turned around. Nuclear war had been averted, barely. Both leaders had stared into the abyss and stepped back. For Khrushchev, it was a bittersweet victory. He had secured Cuba's safety, but at great cost to his reputation. In the Kremlin, his rivals whispered that he had blinked, that he was weak. In Washington, Kennedy emerged as a hero, calm, decisive, and victorious. But in truth, neither side had won. The crisis had shown that the arms race could destroy everything in a matter of hours. A new understanding began to form, one built not on trust, but on survival. Hotlines were installed between Washington and Moscow, allowing leaders to speak directly. It was a small step toward preventing the end of the world. As 1962 came to a close, the two superpowers had faced each other. In the skies, in space, and on the brink of nuclear war. The planet had survived, but barely. The Cold War was no longer a political struggle. It was now a contest for the very future of humanity. The world held its breath. The superpowers had stood face to face, their fingers hovering over the buttons that could end humanity in seconds. Cities trembled not from bombs, but from fear. For the first time in history, mankind had the power to destroy itself and the wisdom to stop just in time. The Cold War had begun, a war not of bullets and blood, but of silence and shadows. Walls were built, nations divided, and a new kind of tension gripped the earth. Yet beneath the fear, a fragile hope remained that one day the world might finally find peace. To be continued. The Age of Détente, 1965 to 1975.